Thank you all for coming today. Learning is in progress. Hopefully we'll get turnouts like this for all of our speakers, particularly important when we have outside speakers coming in. I'm flattered that you're all here to hear me speak about my research. I haven't done it here for a very long time. Normally we go and talk about our research in other places, but we rarely actually talk about our research at home. So I thought I'd take an opportunity to do that. But when we have outside speakers, part of the image they get of who we are as a program and department is represented by how many people fill those seats. So I really strongly implore you, as somebody who's inviting people to come from outside, to make a commitment to come to these. Even if it's a topic that's maybe not squarely in your interest area, it's always valuable to learn something a little bit outside and learn something. So that's my pitch. I'm also going to tell you, pull behind the curtain, I'm hoping to go out and give this talk at a few other places, primarily for the purpose of recruiting graduate students. I have projects where I need to recruit graduate students in this area, and I'm going to go to a few campuses and hopefully tell them and finish by telling them I've got opportunities available. Call me. So I'm interested in your feedback of how effective you think I will be at recruiting graduate students, since you are all graduate students. I failed to recruit some of you already. You've gone to other people's groups, so but that's okay, because you'll do great things here. So, and with that, I'll go ahead and get started then. So I'm going to talk about one branch of my research in agent-based modeling to model nuclear fuel cycles. And this is work I'm going to sort of try and highlight where different students have played a role over the last dozen years or so. Some of those are people you may have heard of and doing exciting things. My group that contributes to all this is the Computational Nuclear Engineering Research Group. Right now, we're about 8 graduate students and a scientist and myself. We live in this larger Institute for Nuclear Energy Systems, which in this case encompasses most of you. And so there's a lot of interesting work going on. And this is just a small slice of it. All right. So I'm going to introduce Cyclus. This is the software tool that we developed here. It's an open source tool with collaboration from around the country and around the world in some cases. I'm talking about why we did it, some of the details of it and the ecosystem that is created. And then I'll go through a few different examples. I'll briefly talk about optimizing nuclear fuel cycles over a transition that's a century long. I'll talk about what it looks like when you disrupt those optimizations. And then I'll talk about some of the work that we have ongoing then in nuclear non-proliferation. This is where I have the most interest. It's this area that if you are a prospective graduate student, you want to pay attention to how you might be able to come and join my group and participate. So nuclear fuel cycles are basically the flow of nuclear material going from the mine to the repository and all the things that come in between. A nuclear fuel cycle simulator is a tool we use to track what those materials look like as they go through, as they're changing their isotopic composition, as they're changing their elemental composition, depending on the processes involved. This shows you what the US nuclear fuel cycle looks like. This is in red because we don't do this part yet. Right? And so we don't really have much of a cycle. We kind of have these steps and we stop. And so to be completely correct and valid, a fuel cycle simulator from an engineering point of view has to track the mass flows, the facility deployments, and all the things that go together as we transition between different fuel cycles. Right? What makes them interesting, what really motivates my interest, in addition to being a software developer, and I love developing software, is how this kind of change, as we change the nuclear fuel cycle, what are the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of making those changes? And these are how do we inform policymakers to steer our federal policy and other policies towards different nuclear fuel cycles in order to achieve certain aims? There's a lot of debate around what the right fuel cycle is. I have opinions on what I think we should be doing in the future, but I also believe that what we should be doing in the future, there's not necessarily political and economic motivation to do it today. So I'm curious to understand what might those motivations be in the future. Here's a potential future fuel cycle where, in addition to material going to the repository, we have material going to separations and then fabricated new fuel for advanced burner or breeder reactors, going to those reactors. And material flows around in a more complicated way. This is a snapshot in time. What we do in a fuel cycle simulator also is we're interested in the dynamics of deploying new facilities, shutting down old facilities, and how those flows change as we do that. So about a dozen years ago, we wrote a great proposal that was funded to develop what we, at that point, generically referred to as the next generation fuel cycle simulator. Right, there were a number of tools that had been developed around the country, mostly at national labs. As a software developer, they all kind of had little burrs under the saddle, if you were. They all had little thorns that pricked at me about the way they were developed. Primarily, one of the concerns is they were built in these proprietary environments that were designed to model stocks and flows. And it was very difficult to do collaborative software development. It was they ran out of resources very quickly. You couldn't be very flexible. In general, places like Idaho National Lab wrote a tool that would solve one question. And then next year, when there's a different question, it wasn't very easy to take that tool and modify it to solve the new question. And so there wasn't a lot of flexibility. So the number one thing we built in here was flexibility. We wanted to design a system from the get-go so that you could be flexible with the kind of questions you were answering, the kind of technologies you were simulating. So the fundamental framework of Cyclus, as we've called it, you'll see that name in a minute, is that there's no inherent technology assumptions, or very few inherent technology assumptions. We also wanted to make some specific modeling choices. Pretty much every other tool, except for a tool called COSY from France, models these facilities as fleets of facilities that all behave homogeneously with continuous flows going in and out of the facilities, which is not how these facilities work. So we wanted to model discrete facilities with discrete quanta of materials going in and out of those facilities. And also we wanted to have a framework that we could easily wrap around optimization and sensitivity analysis, which is another drawback of some of the previous tools and these proprietary sort of Windows GUI based kind of tools. And finally, we're all about open source. So we wanted to have very low barriers to adoption, and we wanted it to be using commonly available software infrastructure. So was born Cyclus. And so three key pieces of it that have proven to continue to be valuable is this agent-based approach. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But what that really means is we take the physics that happens in any given facility and encapsulate it in a way so that it doesn't matter what happens at other facilities. So if we want to model the physics of a particular facility, it's very easy to do that. And so we have the notion of a facility, and facilities are all operated by an institution, and the institution operates in a region. So these are notional ideas, right? A region represents a geopolitical space that may contain multiple institutions. The institution represents a corporate entity or a financial entity that owns and operates facilities. And we anticipated, and what's in fact very timely, if you look at today's headlines, we anticipated, what if we want to model an international fuel cycle where our preferences for receiving material from different countries might change over time? And so this regional, the idea of a region is to allow you to create friction between regions of the flow of materials. The dynamic resource exchange is one of the key technical innovations here. We spend a lot of time figuring out how do you create flexibility in a system where you've got this fungible fissile material moving through the system. And you don't want to hardwire that every time you put in this kind of reactor, you must also have this kind of facility and that kind of facility, and have this permanent connection between the kind of facilities that must exist. And so I'll talk a lot more about the DRE, as we call it. It allows us to take advantage of this substitution between different nuclides that have similar effects in reactors and other facilities. And finally, discrete material tracking, which I mentioned a little bit before, but we want to track materials as discrete quanta. You can think of fuel assemblies as the best example. Rather than a flow of tons of uranium, we're talking about individual fuel assemblies leaving a reactor, entering a reactor, until such a time as they no longer exist in that quanta, such as a separation facility where they be chopped up and dissolved, and maybe come out in some other quanta like a waste form. Our very first release, you may recognize the fountain. We chose to put our bikes there since we called it Cyclists. All right, this was celebrating the end of a week-long hackathon to get that first release out. We were on a few versions beyond that now, but I still like to show this picture. So this guy is going to be coming back in December for a talk. He's the DRE developer. Some of you may know Ariel, who just graduated a year ago. So what was our strategy? We divided this problem up into three pieces. There's an open source kernel, which is the framework, is the environment in which all these agents interact. There's an ecosystem of plugin modules, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. And then we sort of separate from that the visualization analysis. So there's three different pieces of software, if you will, or three different layers that we can develop independently and spread that collaborative into that development process out. So if we look at the kernel first, or look at this goal of flexibility, we start by, again, we talked about individual facility modeling. One of the reasons this is important is you can look at what happens when individual facilities are starting up and shutting down. There's part of the dynamics there. You can also look at what happens if a given facility is disrupted. Perhaps you have a separations facility or a fuel fabrication facility, right? So the fuel fabrication facility in the Southeast, the Westinghouse facility in South Carolina was facing regulatory hurdles a few years ago, and they had some opportunity where they may have to shut down or be delayed for a while, right? So you can have things like that happen in the real world. By modeling individual facilities, you can throw these disruptions in and see how it perturbs the whole fuel cycle when one facility is suddenly unable to operate. Discrete material tracking, we've talked about before. This forensics idea comes in with the non-proliferation analysis. Right? Because we have discrete units, we can track the history of where every single quanta of material has been in its history in a computational sense, and then understand how we might use that in non-proliferation analysis sense. The lowest level of physics assumptions, I'll talk about where those do come in. And then this agent-based approach incorporates social and behavioral models. So how facilities choose to interact with themselves, we can now start to imagine in the real world, these facilities are all run by people, and those people make choices, right? They make choices that aren't based on physics entirely, right? They make choices based on long-term contracts that they may enter into, so that they're getting material from the same facility for 10 years, rather than the cheapest facility that day, things like that. So the kernel basics, this is where the simulation runs. It provides this ecosystem, this environment. Think like a petri dish, the agar in the petri dish for all the bacteria to grow on, right? And it provides an ecosystem. And the key thing that it does is allow these transactions to happen between facilities, right? You can think of the transactions as being like a commodity market, right? Has anyone played the game Pit? No, it's a really fun old card game where you trade grain and try and win all the grain, right? And very loud and noisy and screaming and things like that. So what fundamentally happens at the highest level is we go through time steps. Our typical time step is 1 month, but you can do shorter or longer. And every time step, we start off with all the regions, depending on their demand and depending on what's going on in the region, may request that an institution deploys a facility. Right? The facility gets deployed. The key thing in the middle, then the dynamic resource exchange happens. I'll go into more detail about that. Material flows, and then at the end, the regions may request that institution decommissions facility. This ordering is important because in every time step, new facilities that are just entering get to participate in the exchange, and old facilities that are being decommissioned get to participate before they're decommissioned. The modularity comes through in this notion of what we call archetypes, prototypes, and agents. So in a way that I'm going to describe in a minute, we have this ecosystem with plug and play modules. So many of you have sort of loaded a plug into a browser, right? So we have this notion that at runtime, you can swap out the plugins you're using. That comes in a library. So you may have a library of a facility archetype. It describes the fundamental modeling choices you've made for how to model that facility, right? What fidelity you will use, how you will parameterize it, and so on. You take that facility archetype and you add some parameters, and you get a prototype. And in the next slide, I'll be concrete on what that means. And then you take the prototype and you can create multiple instances that now become agents that can interact in your system. Right? So if that was a reactor, you might have a model for a reactor. Our simplest model for a reactor has basically no physics. You describe what fuel comes in and what fuel goes out. And it can't be disrupted. It can't do anything other than normal. That's just what happens. Right? But that's one choice of modeling. Now you add a power level, you add a cycle length, you add a number of fuel assemblies in the core, you add how many fuel assemblies per cycle, things like that, and you get a particular design of a reactor. And now you can create multiple instances of that reactor, like Sizewell B that exists in the UK, different reactors that have the same parameterization of the same model. And of course, you could have multiple models for a reactor, different parameterizations for the same model, and so on, to get this flexible. That's where the flexibility comes from. The same is true for institutions and for regions, right? You can have a region that has some algebraically defined growth in electricity and nuclear electricity demand. It can have a growth rate, which is representative of a Western country, and it could then be the UK. And so that's part of where this modularity comes into play. The dynamic resource exchange then is the key piece. Matthew Giddin He's lived in Vienna since he graduated. He works for EASA, and he'll be back in December to talk about some of the climate and energy system modeling he does. I encourage you to go to his talk on the 8th of December in the Weston lecture series. He developed and implemented the dynamic resource exchange after many days in front of a whiteboard trying to figure out what it had to do. It happens at every time step. Basically, we conduct a commodity market at every time step. It solves an economic problem dynamically. So because of the agent-based nature, we don't presuppose how agents may interact with each other. That gets unveiled at every time step and then solved at every time step. And this enables fairly complicated fuel cycles that are varying in time as different facilities join the game and lead. So here's how it works. At the very beginning, there's a request for bids. I'm going to use a C to represent a consumer and an S to represent a supplier. You can think of a consumer like a reactor in the simplest sense. So a reactor issues a request that says, I would like to buy 30 tons of uranium oxide fuel enriched to 4.5%. Right? So it has a quantity and a quality. Those are the two notions that we say every commodity must have. The mass would be the quantity in this case, and the enrichment level will be the quality. It issues that out, and all the potential suppliers receive that request. In the next step, then, all the suppliers may respond with a bid. They aren't required to. This supplier may say, I cannot respond. I produce plutonium oxide fuel. I don't produce uranium oxide fuel. There's no point in me responding. Each of the other suppliers may be able to produce something. They may have different quantities available. They, in fact, may have different qualities of it. Just because I've requested 4.5% enriched doesn't mean that everyone's bidding 4.5%. Because we want to leave the agency with the reactor in the event that they get neither bid matching what they want. We want them to be able to decide what's the best choice. The best choice could be nothing, or the best choice could be the closest enrichment, or the best choice could be the closest mass, and there are core designers and they can figure it out, right? Now, in reality, that's probably unlikely to happen in a mature, stable fuel cycle, but we want to give room for those disruptions. So the suppliers all provide their bids, and then every consumer ranks all of those bids and provides a preference. And they say, for all the bids they've received, they give it a preference, right? From 0 being the lowest preference to some highest preference. You can think of this as being the inverse of cost, right? And often we think of these network problems dealing with costs, and we haven't fully integrated the idea of true economic costs, but preference and cost are sort of inversely related to each other. So every consumer ranks all of its bids by cost. But here's where the agents, institutions, and regions come in, is because each of those consumers lives with an institution, and an institution may impose changes to that preference. If I'm a reactor that's owned by some corporate, some state, some nation state, that's my operator, and that nation state also owns a fuel fabricator, then I might prefer to buy my fuel from my own company, even if there's other reasons that may cause me not to prefer it. So the institutional ownership of the agent can affect preference, and the region in which you exist can also affect preference. And at the end, you've got a preference number for everything on the chart. It looks like a big network flow problem, which is a classic type of optimization problem, and you throw it into some kind of solver and maximize the overall preferences. Right? You get a solution which says this provider should provide this material to this consumer, and trade happens. Material moves between facilities, and you go again around the loop. Right? So this is how the whole simulation moves forward. Part of this modular ecosystem then was designed, this is where some of the flexibility comes in. So here in the blue circles represents a notional fuel cycle with different materials, including a loop. And if this represents a reactor here, what we want to get the idea across is that you can plug and play a different module to represent the reactor with different purposes. You could have a module that's export controlled. You could control how that module is exchanged among potential users, and authorized users could use it and plug it into their simulation, along with modules that were open source or commercial in theory. I haven't yet found anyone who wants to commercialize this, but in theory, it should be possible to have modules distributed under all kinds of different circumstances. That's kind of the distribution part. But the interesting part then is also on the fidelity. You can pull out a model that's a low fidelity model and replace it with a model that's a high fidelity model. We've had existence proofs of this done with the idea of a reactor model. right? So the simplest reactor model does no physics. Off to the side, you run some core physics calculation, and you determine that the right input fuel has this composition and that it burns up for 50,000 gigawatt days per ton, and it comes out with this composition. And you define the input and output, and the reactor moves along. At the most extreme example, we have an example of someone who's taken Origin, which is a piece of software developed by Oak Ridge, to track the depletion evolution of fuel during its life in a reactor. And they've wrapped that. It's an example of one of these export controlled modules. They've wrapped it so that it can interact with Cyclus directly. The fuel comes in, you tell the power level, and it runs an origin calculation to figure out what the output fuel is. Somewhere in the middle then, middle fidelity was about the same time a group at University of Texas basically made some meta models, right? Since they're reduced order models of depletion, and said, we're not going to run a full depletion calculation. We're not going to be really naive and assume that all the fuel comes out exactly the same way, but we're going to do some interpolation on tables in between and figure things out that way. And so we've seen that happen. So another feature then of this is it enables distributed development. We can have different teams working on different parts of this because all they have to ensure is that their module is able to make bids and requests for material and make judgment calls on what the preference is for a given bid that comes in. The quality of these modules, right? This is sort of theoretical still. The community is not quite large enough for this to be true, but rather than have, and this is, some of this is talking about the governance of this open source community, right? Is that we don't have one person deciding what's a good module and what's a bad module. We have a community offering up modules and letting individual users investigate those modules, decide which ones actually serve their purpose, which ones get good answers, and things like that. And it gives a lot of room for diversity to drive how this development happens. People with their own questions can use this framework to study their own questions, not driven by some sort of hierarchy of somebody in charge, which is kind of how the national lab versions of this work. Right, and so at the second layer, then we have this ecosystem modules that we provide, right? We call it Sycamore. And it's a standard set of modules. From this set of modules, you can build a lot of standard fuel cycles, start investigating things, but they're very low fidelity primitive representations. So you can put them together and then use that to launch more interesting things. Here's a list of institutions, which I think is still correct and complete, that are engaged in the past or currently. Right, so here's a bunch of institutions that have all been interested in this at different times and in different ways. And here's a bunch of different agencies that have provided funding in terms of direct funding or fellowships and other things like that. I guess one more thing since we're here. To highlight a student, right? So if we want to model a repository in Cyclists using this set of models, you just have a sink. You just have a big place where fuel goes to die and you don't really care much about it. Katie Huff, when she was a graduate student here, her PhD dissertation was on building a repository model, a flexible repository module for Cyclists, where you could change the type of geological formation it was. You could change things like temperature limits in the repository and understand how much repository space you needed as a function of the fuel cycle you could change. Right, and so that was how her work was involved here, and probably informed some of what she does in her current role as assistant secretary. So let's talk about a few applications. All right, this was all developed with the goal of informing fuel cycle simulations, fuel cycle analysis. Right, this was at a time, in about 2010 or so, when maybe a little earlier, where the Department of Energy's focus was how do we steer our research directions towards a more advanced fuel cycle? Sort of return to a world where we may be more interested in recycling, driven to a large degree by the concept at the time that has since gone out of favor a little bit of repository benefit, right? If we reduce the type of material we send to a repository, we can get more use out of the repository. That's a whole other talk as to why that's changed. So you can do simple things like just compare two choices of technologies. Then you can sort of one level deeper is to optimize and say we've got a set of technologies. At what rate and when do we deploy those technologies to optimize our fuel cycle for a given objective? And then the next layer, which I'll spend some time talking about, which was really fun to work on, was how do we hedge against disruptions, right? And I'll talk about why that came up. In the last 6 or 7 years, we've turned our focus towards non-proliferation analysis. So for a variety of reasons, the Department of Energy is less interested in fuel cycle transition for the time being. Maybe that's returning again. partly because they became very interested in saving the existing fleet of reactors and not worrying about building new reactors. I think we've been successful. Policy-wise, we've been successful. I'm not sure about technology-wise. Non-proliferation analysis then became an interest to me because we always had in the back of our heads that with this discrete material tracking and individual facility tracking, there would be signatures of those flows and those operations that we could then use to inform the non-proliferation regime. So from things like diversion detection, breakout time, acquisition pathway analysis, I'll go through some notional ideas, a few of those, and show you where we're going next. So we're going to skip over fuel cycle comparisons and jump to optimization. All right, so this is a low-tech representation of some advanced fuel cycle. Here you see most of we've got enrichment where depleted uranium goes to some sink. We've got fresh fuel, it gets stored. It may go to separations, that goes to repository, and so on. So we've got this future fuel cycle, which has fast reactors. All light water reactor fuel is separated. None of it goes straight to the repository. Right? We want to transition to this from a world with 100 light water reactors operating at steady state. All the fast reactors, so LWR is light water reactor, this is sodium fast reactor. They'll all use recycled fuel. It will start being available no sooner than 35 years from the beginning of the simulation. We will simulate for 200 years. That'll become important. And we're going to assume a 1% electricity demand growth, nuclear electricity demand growth, but we're going to have a 10%, fudge room on that, right? If you constrain it, if you force it to be exactly 1%, it gets difficult because you build reactors in increments of a certain size, and it doesn't match 1%. So the 10% gives us room to build a few and wait a few years and build it. And it actually has some subtle impact on how it evolves. So you can build a framework then. So one simulation will run with some, it's here, right? So you can build an optimization framework. Let's see what it's built upon. A given individual simulation, the inputs, in addition to defining the prototypes of these different facilities, is basically how many do I build in each year? How many repositories do I build? How many fuel fabrication? For every facility you may have, for every prototype you have in your system, the input that the decision space of your optimization problem is how many of each of those facilities do I build each year? And then you run your Cyclus simulation, and you get a whole bunch of outputs of how much material flows where and when. And then you run a metric calculation based on those outputs of evaluates your objective function, whatever it may be, and you get a score. And you can do that many times with different sets of inputs, and then put that into an optimizer. And so that it will take all of those and steer this towards a correct answer. Right? If you have a kernel of your optimization function, which produces gradients and gives you all kinds of high quality information, then there's all kinds of high quality optimizers you can use. If you have what's largely a black box kind of kernel, where you've got a bunch of inputs and a bunch of outputs, you end up relying on genetic kind of algorithms and swarm kind of algorithms, things that learn about the space as it interrogates it, rather than being able to take advantage of gradients and things like that. So we ended up with a swarm optimizer, which I'm not going to talk a lot about or any about. Yep.
Yeah. So you mentioned that we're trying to be technology agnostic as much as possible. But when you are trying to implement an SFR in your model, we don't have a lot of, technology proven SFRs out there. So how do you make up this mass quality and depletion? Because that's
Sure.
kind of technology dependent, right?
So for a given simulation, you have to be technology specific, right?
Okay.
The framework is technology agnostic.
Okay.
Because it means that you can define a reactor, you can define a fast reactor. You can change the fundamental model you use. Now in this simulation, we use our very primitive model, but you can do a calculation of different conversion ratios for the fast reactor, for example, and get different input-output fuel combinations, and then run different simulations with, one where you use one conversion ratio with an input equilibrium fuel and an output equilibrium fuel, one with a different conversion ratio. Mm-hmm. And so there's flexibility just to change the prototype, but then you could also have flexibility in archetype. And then you could just have flexibility on a completely different concept of the fast reactor.
Yeah.
But for any given simulation, you have to fix on one technology.
Okay, and so this could actually be communicating with another software, for instance, to actually get that kind of depletion from a sodium fast reactor that you may not have.
Right,
in your view,
right.
right?
So,
Okay.
so for the purpose of all the results I'm going to show here, we were collaborating with a team at Argonne who was running a core simulation with a particular fast reactor design and energy level and conversion ratio, and giving us the fuel composition to input and output. And we did do some work looking at the conversion ratio, so they gave us different combinations of input and output fuel. You could do that, with a high fidelity reactor. You could do that in the flow. You could, but that's a modeling decision of whether that's the way you want to spend your time. Like that, you'll see why you might not want to do that for the kind of calculations you do here. So now, when you optimize it, you're going to run many different simulations. Ideally, they don't take a lot of time, and then you're going to let your optimizer steer through this decision space and find the optimal solution. A typical objective function, a very simple objective function for a transition like this, is take the total amount of energy produced by light water reactors over the entire simulation, divided by the total energy produced by light water reactors, and minimize that. What that's effectively doing is saying we want to transition as quickly as possible. Right? By minimizing this, it captures a number of things. Any energy produced by light water reactor is bad. Doesn't mean you're not going to have it, it's just bad. It rewards energy from fast reactors, and indirectly there's a penalty for not fueling fast reactors. Right. So another thing that can happen in Cyclus, so digression, that often can happen in other tools is you can build reactors and only to find there's not enough fuel. And then they sit idle. They don't get fuel, they don't turn on, they don't produce energy. Right. Now that's obviously going to be bad, because in this case, if you build fast reactors too soon, you're going to still have the light water reactors running. And you're not, and so this is still going to be captured. I mean, you can have more complicated objective functions to be sure, but this is a nice simple one that we started. And so if you run a simulation like this, you get answers that look kind of like this, right? So here is our this only goes 120 years here. Here you see the light water reactor power level, right? So it's growing. We're actually building new light water reactors. At some point we stop because fast reactors become available. And now you see the light water reactors turn on. And we see the fast reactors come in and meet this demand. In this case, we did not have a 10% margin. In this case, we did have the 10% margin. It allows them to have a little flexibility here. And the big difference you see, it's not that big a difference, you see very subtle differences down here at the very end of the light water reactors. Because of this, we are forced to build a few extra light water reactors, because if we don't, we're going to have unfueled fast reactors. The dynamics of the material is available in the system. If we don't build light water reactors, we're going to have unfueled fast reactors. We're not going to meet our energy demand, and things are not satisfied. By having a little bit of wiggle room to not meet the demand, we can sort of have a delay and then bring in more fast reactors later on, right? And so it's a small effect in this particular simulation, but it's due to that, simply to put in the bounds of that objective function. In this particular project, they had a human at Argonne hand optimize the deployment schedule because their tools weren't able to automatically do it. And we basically match the deployment schedule that was hand generated by somebody to minimize plutonium reserves and things like that as well. That comes to this. So when the other outcomes of this, it's often important, particularly in the US context, is what's the total amount of separated plutonium-239 that we ever have on hand. And here you see some of those quantities, right? And so in this simulation, we get up to 800 tons. In this simulation, we stay below 600 tons, right? And that was one of the differences that was also important, right? To minimize that. We didn't include the objective function, but it's one of the consequences. So that's an optimization, but it occurred to me that we do these optimization problems, these fuel cycle transitions, and they take 100 or more years. Right? You can see here, right, that fast reactors become available here because of the lifetime of these technologies. They're 60-year lifetimes in this model. The change over time is very slow. And so it takes you 100 years to fully get rid of light water reactors, to be completely at steady state in the future. That's a very long transition for an energy transition.
So Paul, quick question on the light water reactor's lifetime. Does this account for at year zero that some light water reactors are already 40, 50 years into their lifetime, or this is all of these are?
So what you're seeing here is a not exact model of the current life of our existing reactors, but they all are born with some used life already.
Okay.
And so these are them shutting down. You know, the first ones that shut down are the ones sort of over a range of time. They're all just stopped the first 100. So the transition is very long, and it relies on sort of policy decisions And so there's a lot of assumptions and approximations we make in a model like this, but it occurred to me the biggest assumption we're making is that we don't change our minds at all, right? All of you read the headlines. Our government is not very good at having a consistent policy for that duration of time. And so I became interested in this question of what happens if there's a disruption, right? And there's many kinds of disruptions that can happen. And this is really interesting work I'll highlight briefly in France that came after this that looked at a wider variety of disruptions. But you know, these transitions tend to take a long time, right? Single biggest assumption. I just said all this. Okay. So here's going to be some math. So bear with me. I thought about whether there's a graphical way to represent this. There's really not. We're going to sort of go through, based on this notion of optimization, we'll go through how things build. Right. So let's start with this D, this variable D. This is a deployment schedule when we build how many facilities. That has some outcome. It may not be optimal, it's just a deployment schedule. E sub D will be the time in the future when a disruption occurs. So D hat then is a deployment schedule that starts from some arbitrary deployment schedule here, suffers a disruption at TD and is optimized following that disruption to have an optimal output, optimize that objective function after the disruption occurs, after there's some change in the dynamics, the parameterization of the problem. Right? O then is the value of that objective function if you follow this post-disruption optimized schedule. And this P is the probability distribution of when this disruption might occur. All right. We don't really know this a priori, but we can use lots of different models for how disruptions occur. So if we have a model for what the probability of a disruption occurring is, and we know what the value of the objective function is for starting off from any given deployment schedule with a disruption occurring at some time, we can then integrate over that space and get the expected value of the objective function for deployment schedule that starts as D and is subject to disruption that may happen due to some probability distribution in the future. Right? There's a lot in there that sort of builds on itself, right? And so now we can say, well, if we change D, if we change our very first assumption of how we should begin this transition, can we achieve the lowest expected value of that objective function, subject to all the possible disruption? Right? So that's what we now optimize. We now optimize H with respect to how we began. I should think of a good analogy like climbing a hill or something like that, right? If you're climbing a mountain, you might want to start on you might decide you're going to start on the shallower path, and then suddenly find that there's a cliff in front of you and you would be better off on a different path, right? And I'll have to work on that more, but there's got to be a simpler analogy. So this requires a lot of computing. To find the optimal value of H, we have to have many evaluations of H sub D, which itself was many things, perhaps 10 to the 5 different evaluations in our swarm optimization algorithm. Each evaluation of H sub D requires at least a few evaluations of this optimum, right? To do this integral over the probability distribution, let's say it's order 10. Each evaluation of this, because it's an optimization problem itself, requires order 10 to the 5 evaluations of this. Right, and so to rigorously do all of this with our optimization tool, it's something like 10 to 11 different Cyclus simulations that have to run. That's a lot, even for our great computers. That's a lot, right? So to overcome this, in this particular work, we use an approximation, and we, instead of calculating all of these, we approximated. I'm not going to go into the details of that approximation, but we saved ourselves this one, and we ended up with 10 to the 6 calculations, right? Which is still a lot. We have a great resource, the Center for High Throughput Computing, where you can launch 10 to the 6 independent simulations, and they'll kind of go through the computer like a mouse goes through a snake. And sort of start with a few simulations and then does a bunch of simulations and then get a few at the end, right? And so we used a model like this sort of Poisson model for when the disruptions may occur, right? Very zero probability at the beginning and pretty high probability and then tailing off forever. Our timeline only goes about this far, and so we normalized for that. And then we modified the objective function slightly. So this was the initial objective function you saw that optimizes light water reactors. But this objective function is basically the inverse of the capacity factor of the system. Like the sort of time average capacity factor. This is the total capacity, the total energy generated. And so now we want to maximize the capacity factor. We don't want a bunch of facilities sitting idle. And you get things that look like this. So here is a simulation that began and a disruption happened very early. And then it was optimized after that disruption. And so the disruption, I forgot to say out loud, we chose a disruption that says that the amount of plutonium that's produced from the separations process is computationally arbitrarily reduced by 33%. Right? That's not a realistic situation, but it represents a policy change where you're more concerned about separating plutonium. Right? What it means is that your fast reactors can't do as much work because you don't have material for them. So what you see is if the disruption happens early, you optimize and you never stop building light water reactors. Right? You realize that you can't do enough with fast reactors, you don't have plutonium, so you have to keep light water reactors in your system. If the disruption happens a little bit later, you try to correct, but you've already built these fast reactors, and you end up actually getting a point in time where you don't produce enough energy. Right? Now, our simulation doesn't really account for that a lot, but in objective function, but it becomes part of the reality. Right? If you have a really late disruption in your host, you've shut down all your light water reactors, you've got a bunch of fast reactors, you're out of material, you can't run them anymore, you're not producing enough electricity, things are just bad. Right? This is the sort of all-encompassing output. All right, and so this is a frequency distribution of how often the final objective function value occurs. Low is better, as a function of the different ways that you started. Right, and so this is sort of 10 different starting points. This is the best starting point for disruption that happens early, the best starting point for disruption that happens late. And now this is the best starting point for the whole probability of when disruptions might happen. Right, and you see a subtle difference here, but if you look at the biggest differences, you see that there's the purple line is what we decide is best when we're hedging against disruptions. We see there's some situations that actually have a better objective function. Okay. But they also have a lot of bad cases. And so if you look overall, the expected outcome is better for the purple line, than the ones that have slightly lower. This problem maybe doesn't highlight it as wildly as others might, but you see some of that effect there. I'll just jump over this quickly. This is a really interesting way of characterizing the different kinds of disruptions that can occur, whether they're policy or technology and things like that. This is from thesis done in France. It's at Cyclus. One of these is wrong, but one of these is correct. Sorry, I could fix that. Two different collaborative dissertations. I was on their committees. It was really fascinating work. They produced plots like this, where you see trade-offs between how much substitution of different isotopes you use and how much total transuranics are separated, and you've got Pareto curves trading off against those. And read the dissertation. It's worth it. So, in summary, for this part, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about the non-proliferation. So we've got this open source framework. We can automate this optimization. We can use that to explore disruptions and hedging against different outcomes. This one kind of off normal.
Question about are you able to use your model more like as to actually train it on what has happened in the past to verify if the disruption modeling that you're using is actually valid? Because we've had disruption in the past, right?
Right. So validation.
Yeah, validation of the model using past data.
Right. So the question of validation comes up a lot in fuel cycle simulation. It's a very difficult thing to do because you have to model a lot of subtle behaviors and subtle effects that may never happen again. Right? So it's fundamentally different from modeling physics, where as you increase the fidelity and increase the number of things that you include in your model, you know those things happen. They happened yesterday, they happened 100 years ago, they're going to happen in the future. And there's a lot of value in doing that kind of modeling. Here, you can basically overtrain your system and tweak it to match all the subtle policy changes and the change in burnup over the fleet of the reactors over time and things like that. People have done some of those things where they capture the technology changes, but not so much the policy changes, because you can spend a lot of time figuring out how to model a policy change from 10 years ago, but it may not be, basically it's unclear whether it's worth it, because the exact same policy change in the future may never happen. So there's a lot of code-to-code benchmarking, right? These codes aren't considered to be predictive. They're really for comparison and indications of things, right? So you see plots like this, and you can get some indication of where in the space is better than other places in the space. but not so much. This was all done with a tool called COSY from CEA, and that's one of the highest fidelity tools. It's built from, many of the tools in the US are built from very simple models and gradually adding fidelity. This was built from some of the standard French reactor analysis tools and combining them together to make a high fidelity tool. And in some cases, they then reduce fidelity because they didn't need it, things like that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about non-proliferation. And here I'm going to have a smattering of a few different ideas, some of which we've proven in concept, but there's some interesting angles in working in this space to make it difficult, even more difficult in the validation space, particularly basically because you get into very sensitive questions. All right, it's difficult to work with subject matter experts and have them actually tell you whether your answer is right or not. And so we're working out some of that, including one of my students came in. I didn't actually highlight the students enough, so I talked about Katie Huff's work on the repositories. The DRE was all done by Matt Gidden, who will be here in December. The hedging was all done by Robert Carlson, who went to work at Idaho and the Moose team. And some of the work here is done by Megan McGarry, who is now a scientist at Livermore. And then we're going to finish with some work that Katie Muma is doing in her dissertation at Los Alamos right now. And so one of the simple things we want to look at is how can we detect whether or not HEU is being generated in enrichment facility. So our basic enrichment facility is also very primitive. You have a total amount of enrichment capacity that it can do, and you allow it to do whatever kind of enrichment it wants, which is not realistic. But in this case, we had two different consumers. One was a fleet of light water reactors requesting some sort of random amount of material over time. This is what the requests look like. This is what the requests look like. They didn't always get that much. We also had, in this case, it's more regular, but we had versions of it where it's random. We have somebody who's requesting high enriched uranium, right? And the question was, since this has a fixed capacity, can we detect just by looking at what's coming out on the public side, whether or not something's happening on the clandestine side? And we've got the declared facility and the clandestine facilities. And can we detect the variations that are happening here? And does it give a signal that we can use for this? So we did some different statistical analysis, and in certain sort of contrived cases you can, but it's sort of a proof of principle of where we might want to go next. One of the questions becomes, what are the signatures we can simulate? Over here, we're looking at the cumulative frequency of swipe tests for uranium. So one of the ways that they actually, the IAEA actually does tests is they swipe inside an enrichment facility, and you can have false positives and false negatives. So for some rate of false positives and false negatives, you accumulate over time some hypothesis for whether or not high enrichment has occurred there. This is a simplified model of atmospheric transmission of radionuclides. Two declared facilities. And what if you were to build an undeclared facility in the lee of that, so that as radionuclides are emitted, they create this field where it's hard to detect the ones coming out of the undeclared facility. We got into some work looking at simulating, these don't look like great pictures, but simulating the structure from a satellite image, right? Of a facility, the reactor's on with a steam, the reactor's off, the reactor's on. You know, can we put together simulated images that we could then apply some of the techniques that are being worked on by others to look at images and determine whether or not people are behaving bad. We did a little bit of work looking at higher fidelity models of enrichment facilities, nominally to look at the JCPOA with Iran. And so we said, what if we took the cascades they're allowed to have? Each of these represents a cascade that's permitted under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, informally known as the Iran deal. And what if they were to arrange these and feed material into the cascades, take material out and feed it back into additional cascades and gradually enrich material more without changing the configuration of those cascades? Now, if you were wanting to produce high enriched uranium, you would not arrange your centrifuges in this way. But we said, well, what if they wanted to do this without rearranging their centrifuges? Okay. And so we built a model that could do that, and then looked at different assumptions of how that would work and whether they're recycling. And we see that, you know, over the set of 6 different cases, this is the rate at which we think they can produce high enriched uranium, right, in kilograms per year. If they took those centrifuges and arranged them ideally for that purpose, this is what rate it would be, right? So by restricting them to the one conclusion, if you believe their numbers, and this is one of the places no one will tell us if our numbers are right, but if you believe these numbers, one conclusion is that it delays them by a factor of 2 or more by forcing these centrifuges to be arranged in this way. Another area that's of interest, the IAEA does something called state level analysis. So rather than, in addition to individual safeguards analysis as material is flowing in different facilities, there's a state level approach where they look at all the facilities that exist in the country and identify the pathways that may exist for the production of special nuclear material. Los Alamos has produced a tool that's somewhat proprietary for them to use to do that. But we realized if we have a description of the fuel cycle in Cyclus, we can just walk over that graph of that fuel cycle and figure out what the pathways are. So Katie Muma's work, initially, the first part of her work was to develop an open source tool that would take a fuel cycle description in Cyclus and map it out in a bunch of pathways so you could determine what are the pathways that meet certain requirements and certain, right? So here's the Cyclus input file, and magically you get out of it a picture like this, and then you go through what are all the pathways to a given facility, for example? What are all the pathways that involve a certain material? What are all the pathways that could involve a certain diversion method, right? Her work is continuing, right? So the next steps in this and where I need to hire students and where I need more help is improving facility fidelity, right? I've talked about these very crude models of facilities that we've used for fuel cycle analysis. They're not the best model to use for non-proliferation analysis. We need to improve the process fidelity within the facility, at least to get to the idea of material balance areas. These are areas that are formally declared by the IAEA over which you have to prove that material in and out matches and things like that. We need to improve how we, because diversion is most likely to happen during shipments, we have to improve how we model shipments, right? How many assemblies go on a truck, how many barrels go on a train, things like that. And then we have to introduce sets of behaviors that represent those kinds of diversion. So Katie's at Los Alamos working on this. And then finally, ideally, we would also model different kinds of signatures and get more sophisticated there. So I'm going to finish there. I'm seeking graduate students. All of you are spoken for probably, but if you're not, come talk to me. Or if you want to change because I've been so compelling, come talk to me, but not with your advisor around. You can go to the website fuelcycle.org to learn more about Cyclists, and I'm happy to have any questions. Aiden?
I'm interested in the bidding process optimization. So are the bids sealed? Do other agents know what the other agents are bidding?
No, the bids are all private.
So the bids are all private.
Only the receiving agent bids.
And so is the bids optimized to be competitive against other actors?
So the agent, not inherently, right?
Okay.
So the part of the agency is each of the agents gets to determine how they choose their bid, right?
Right.
So you can imagine implementing a sophisticated algorithm that would attempt to do that, right? For example, we've imagined, so a number of algorithms we've imagined but never actually implemented. One I mentioned already, long-term contracts, right?
Yep.
Another one is if you've bid similar thing for 2 time steps and nobody takes your bid, decrease your price, right? Or do something to make your bid more attractive, right? We haven't talked about price specifically, but do something to make your bid more attractive so that you become the person who's chosen, right? And so you could imagine implementing a model that has some historical perspective and use that historical perspective to change your future actions. We haven't really imagined a model with open bids because then there's a whole layer of iteration has to go around as people jockey
So currently you set a fix. This actor will always bid this into the market.
Right now, we only bid on quantity and quality. So an actor will bid into the market the amount of material they have available in the form that it's in.
Okay.
A slightly smarter actor would maybe know that plutonium and uranium exchange in a certain way, and we bid a quality that they think is going to be attractive to the consumer. We do have some work. There was one thing we did to be able to query. So there is one offshoot, one paper we had at an ANS meeting where we looked at the ability for the supplier to ask the consumer what they think of it. They don't get to see the other bids, but they get to learn how the consumer would evaluate it. Because of the separation in the agency, the supplier has no idea what decision-making strategy the consumer needs.
Yeah.
So we have introduced that notion so the supplier can say, I offered you this, what would you think? And sort of at least make the best bid for that consumer, even though they don't know what the other bids are.
And then I guess the logical next step would be the consumer could change their, could they change their facility to cater to the bids that are coming in?
They could imagine I mean, in a reactor sense, you could have a different core configuration.
Yeah.
Right, but then you'd have to have a reactor model that could model that physics.
Yeah.
What do you got?
Thanks for the talk. My first question is, in a year from now, are you looking for a postdoc? My second question is, a more logistical one, where between modules, right? You said that, you model every single stage of this, cycle. How do you, when you parameterize your inputs and outputs to make them compatible, to make the outputs of one module compatible to the input of the other module, how do you go about obtaining your parameters? Like, you scrape publicly available data? Do you get them from institutions? Is that proprietary, etc.?
So many answers to that. I think you're asking about the sort of material flow inputs and outputs, right? So for most of the models we've done here, there's not a lot of rigidity there, right? We assume the input to a reactor is going to be in a certain form, right? And so we build fuel fabricators that will respond to that request. So if you've got a reactor that's asking for 4.5% enriched uranium oxide, it will request 4.5%. The fabricator will request 4.5% uranium oxide from the enrichment facility, and it will provide you with exactly what you asked for. And so the difference is, so there, I've described a lot of potential sophistication. The reality is, on the fuel cycle modeling side, a lot of that interest kind of faded away before we got to get to that level of sophistication, of really looking at what happens when you've got a true mismatch. But built into this, which was novel, is the idea that it's possible for a consumer to not be able to find the material it wants, right? And other fuel cycle simulators don't allow that to happen. They sort of stop in the middle and say, this is an invalid outcome. Try again and give me new inputs. We allow that to go on. The facility just sits idle. And ideally, you have an objective function that's going to score that poorly because you don't want facilities sitting idle. But we wanted to build in the idea that you can have facilities that are idle, and that's a bad thing. And there's going to be consequences to it. So it doesn't quite answer your question. I think to come back to your question, there's lots of ways to do that. And it depends on how you choose to implement each of those facility models and the level of sophistication you want to put in there.
Okay, and a quick follow-up question to that. So if you have a chain of if you string multiple modules together, is that proprietary to your group, or is that something like ostensibly like a government agency can say, hey, I have these modules, they're all wrapped, but and therefore I can't give them to you, but I want to use them in series, like who's the audience? I guess who is the audience for these multiple modules in series?
So good question. We were brainstorming and reassociating in the beginning. So I think if I understand your question, there's lots of pieces to it. So an individual producer of a module, like a software developer like me who wants to make a module to represent a reactor, can distribute it under whatever terms they like. I can charge money for it. It's possible. Well, I like or my government likes, right? So it's possible it could be export controlled and then I have to limit it, or I can make it open source or anything in between. If I run a simulation with a bunch of modules that I've designed, and I choose to make all those modules open source, anyone can use those modules to do a similar calculation. One of the really stretch goals, probably like career kind of goals, is for a platform like this to be, for the fundamentals to be widely enough understood and accepted, that different audiences with different value systems could use the same platform and study the same system, potentially reaching different conclusions, right? One of the topics, I'm going to have a call tomorrow with someone about an NEP proposal. I don't think there's competitors in the room. So there's been 2 or 3 hot topics that have come up in the last 6 months. One of them is waste from advanced reactors, right? There was a big paper suggesting that advanced reactors, because they're smaller and because of short lifetimes and a bunch of things, are actually going to produce more waste than traditional light water reactors. Cyclists can answer that question, right? In a way that can be done systematically and potentially allow different communities with different viewpoints to come together and debate where their assumptions differ rather than debate where their conclusions differ, right? Another place is on Russian uranium, right? There's a great concern right now for the supply of HALEU to fire up these advanced reactors that are going to need 19% enriched uranium, when for the last decade, we've assumed we're going to get it from Russia. And now that seems unlikely for a whole bunch of reasons. We don't want it, and actually give it to us if we wanted it, and all kinds of things like that. So, so what's going to happen? What does the HALEU supply look like? And we can model that. Amanda Bachman at Illinois on an NEUP fellowship has been studying some of the HALEU work already, I think. And I'm going to look to work with her advisor, Madikin, there to try and put together a couple of those different topics and talk about that. And we had somebody from ClearPath at the boot camp was asking, how long can we do without Russian? How long can we do without Russian uranium? Or how soon can we do without Russian uranium? Those questions I think we can maybe answer there too. One more question from Sam. Sorry, young thing.
Oh, I just had a question regarding the disruptions. So at least in the models, it seems like the disruptions happen very suddenly and without any knowledge that the disruption could happen, when realistically, I mean, most people are informed of what policies are not going to be established. Is there any sort of, do the modules allow for that sort of modeling of anticipating disruptions?
The short answer is the modules allow for anything because of the flexibility that's there. You'd have to develop a model for how that disruption would unveil itself. You'd have to understand how people would, what the behavioral response would be to the early indications of that disruption, and then build it all into how the facilities respond and say things like that. That's another couple of dissertations worth of work. If you're interested. It's not here. It's not. All right, thank you very much. I'll let you all go. I'm happy to answer other questions or